See such a great crowd out this evening. There are a few individual seats, so please find yourself a seat. I'm Heather Coleman. I'm the director of the program on religion and culture at the Canadian Institute of Ukrainian Studies, and so it's a real pleasure to welcome all of you to our annual BOHDAN lecture tonight. Dr. Balan began his academic career at the University of Alberta, where he taught in the Department of Political Science from 1956 to 1969. He went on to teach at Carleton University in Ottawa, where he founded the Institute of Soviet and East European Studies, which is now the Institute of European and Russian Studies, and he served as its first director. A specialist in Soviet politics, with a special emphasis on Soviet Ukraine and church-state relations, he was the author of a great many books and articles. His final book, The Ukrainian Greek Catholic Church and the Soviet State, 1939 to 1950, was published by CIUS Press in 1996 and remains the authoritative work on the subject in English, and I think actually in other languages too. In 1994, Dr. BOCIURKIW's generous donation of his extensive library and archives to the CIUS represented the first step in the eventual creation of the research program on religion and culture. The collection contains many unique items and documents pertaining to the Ukrainian Church, including documents drawn from the closed archives of the Communist Party and the KGB, and it served as the basis for the program's research reference library. The annual BOCIURKIW Memorial Lecture brings to Edmonton a specialist working in the subject areas that preoccupied Professor BOCIURKIW throughout his career: religion and politics and Ukraine and Ukrainians. Over the next few years, Ukrainians in Ukraine, in Canada, and wherever they are found around the world will be marking the 100th anniversary of a period of revolution and civil war as the Russian and Austro-Hungarian empires collapsed and new political entities were born. A critical component of this revolutionary era, and one that crossed the ocean to have an important impact here in Canada, was the religious revival, experimentation, and reorganization that accompanied political transformations. This is a topic that preoccupied Professor BOCIURKIW throughout his career. Indeed, his doctoral thesis dealt with the Orthodox Church and the Ukrainian Revolution, and one of his very first published articles dealt with the autocephalous movement in Ukraine. It's safe to say that he authored the foundational works on issues of Ukrainization and autocephaly in the Orthodox Church. So as we were thinking about the BOCIURKIW lecture for this year and for the next few years, we wanted to draw attention to the church in the revolutionary era, and we decided to begin by marking a very important example of this religious experimentation and the new religious possibilities that accompanied the reshuffling of empires and of religious boundaries in the Ukrainian-speaking world. The founding of the Ukrainian Orthodox Church in Canada 100 years ago. And so it's a great pleasure to welcome today's BOCIURKIW lecturer. In this case, not someone who's brought from elsewhere, but someone who's very familiar to many of us in the room, Yars Balan. Yars is the current director of the Canadian Institute of Ukrainian Studies and the administrative coordinator of the Cool Canadian Studies Center at CIUS. He's written and published extensively on the history of Ukrainians in Canada and has a special interest in Ukrainian Canadian literature, theater, and church history. Raised and always active in the Ukrainian Orthodox community, he first became interested in the founding and evolution of Canada's Ukrainian Orthodox Church when he worked on editing Paul Yuzik's The Ukrainian Greek Orthodox Church in Canada, 1918 to 1951, which was published by the University of Ottawa Press in 1981. He then immersed himself in the history of Christianity in Ukraine during the 1988 millennium of the baptism of Kiev and Rus, publishing a long article on the subject that appeared as a supplement to the Edmonton Journal and a brochure, 1,000 Years of Kievan Christianity, put out by the Ukrainian Studies Centre at Macquarie University in Australia. He also developed a fascination with Ukrainian religious life in Canada, inspired in part by many years he has spent traveling to rural Ukrainian settlement areas across the country and conducting and coordinating research on the Ukrainian-Canadian experience. His work with the Kalina Country Eco-Museum and investigations into the life of Michael Gauda, the first Ukrainian resident of Edmonton, have especially enriched and broadened his understanding of the complexities of both institutional religion as well as matters of faith. In addition to journalistic articles, he's the author of several scholarly essays examining different aspects of Ukrainian Christianity in the New World. So Yaros' presentation tonight, An Unorthodox History of the 1918 Founding of the Ukrainian Greek Orthodox Church in Canada, draws on the findings that he's made in different sources over several decades. Please join me in welcoming Yaros.
Thank you, Heather, and thank you all for coming out to allowing me to subject you to some of my ideas on this subject of the founding of our church. I have a question. How many of you have been on Kalina Country church tours with me? Oh, no. Okay. I'll try to stay consistent to the stories that I tell you on that, but I don't promise it. Mine is a prehistory of the Ukrainian Greek Orthodox Church of Canada. But I'm going to start with the formation of that church. On 17 July 1918, the Edmonton Journal ran an article under the rather sensational heading, quote, Ruthenian nationalists plan political party to prevent assimilation with Canadians, with the subheading, Movement is to preserve their customs and language. Datelined from Toronto, the story revealed that, quote, with the object of preventing the assimilation into the Canadian nationality of the Ruthenians, who in Canada now number some 200,000 with from 5 to 12 children in a family. Talk about a red flag, eh? You know? A secret conference of Ruthenian nationalist leaders of the Western provinces will be held in Saskatoon on July 18th and 19th. While the ostensible object of the meeting is to found a Ruthenian national church in Canada, of which Reverend Rodkevich of Montreal, a Ruthenian Catholic priest, has already been chosen as bishop. I think that was probably news to him. To be a political, has been chosen as bishop. The move is acknowledged by its sponsors, according to prominent local Ruthenians, to be political rather than a religious one. Well, that was the label that got stuck with our church, for the Ukrainian Orthodox Church, for a long time, that this was a political creation, not a religious one. The church which is being founded is designed to be a backing for the Ruthenian nationalistic movement to preserve Ruthenian customs and language, and to serve as a protective wall to prevent the assimilation of Ruthenians with other Canadians. Another red flag. This meeting means a break of Ruthenian nationalists with the Ruthenian bishop Budka, whom they accuse of giving over the Ruthenians to the French Catholic Church in Canada. There are three divisions among Canadian Ruthenians: those who favor affiliation with the French Catholics, those who are for assimilation with the Canadian nation, and by that they mean the Protestant churches, and the nationalists, who oppose any assimilation with other French Canadians. This, of course, is totally wonky. There's no mention of Russian Orthodox here, or Russo Orthodox people. The secret conference is to be held in the Ruthenian National House at the corner of Avenue I and 19th Street, Saskatoon, and those who will present will be, and there's a long list of names, many of them mangled, but I'm just going to mention a couple. W. Kudryk, the editor of Ukrainian Voice, he later became a priest in the Ukrainian Orthodox Church. J.D. Ferley, it should be Taras Ferley, MLA. Stecheshin, they just mentioned Stecheshin. There were several brothers in the family, and they played a very important role in the founding of the church. Stratichuk, they forgot the K, but Stratichuk also became a a priest in the church. Rurik, Yaroslav Rurik, who was from Alberta. Zvaric, a very well-known name, of course, in this neck of the woods, and others. They don't mention there was actually 158 people who came to this, but given the complicated forces at play and the equally complex religious and political landscape of the Ukrainian community at a critical juncture in its evolution, it is not surprising that the announcement of the secret meeting, a day before it was supposed to happen, so it wasn't a secret really, is both confused and confusing. However, even though it is riddled with factual and spelling errors and contains several questionable characterizations, the report nevertheless captures part of the motivation behind the meeting in Saskatoon and the issues it hoped to address. On 20 July 1918, so after this meeting, the Toronto Star carried a short news item on a page largely devoted to want ads and several reports of local interest, bearing the heading, "Independent of the Pope, Ruthenians of the West break away from Rome, form new Greek Orthodox Church." The Canadian Press Dispatch announced the following: Saskatoon, July 20th. The Ruthenians in conference here yesterday considered the report of a commission appointed to draft a message on the subject of the formation of a new church. After long discussion, a resolution was passed calling for the establishment of the Ukrainian, often they forget the I, Greek Orthodox Church of Canada. The church will be independent of Rome altogether. A Ukrainian Greek Orthodox Theological College will be established in Saskatoon. Over $2,000 was subscribed for the purpose of founding the college and for the publicity campaign to propagate the church. With this brief note, the Star documented the historic gathering in Saskatoon on 19 July, who resolved to form a brotherhood charged with the task of bringing into existence an Orthodox Church for Ukrainians in Canada. The account followed several sensational reports of the 12 July arrest of Bishop Nikita Budka, the head of the Ukrainian Catholic Church, while on a pastoral visit to Hafford, Saskatchewan, on a charge of sedition. So the timing of this is all very important. So this is just a few days before this secret meeting. You have the Catholic bishop being arrested. It's all got lots of coverage in the press. It was a big sensational event. What happened was a Belgian Redemptorist priest in the Catholic Church was giving a sermon, and he made comments that offended somebody in the church who called him a liar, and the bishop responded, and it was a fiasco. Anyway, the charges were dropped within a couple of days, but it certainly contributed to the whole atmosphere at this period. While accurate in its details, the 20 July news story failed to convey the momentous weight of the decision or the complex forces that led it to being taken. The secret meeting in Saskatoon understandably garnered more extensive coverage in papers in the Canadian West, where the vast majority of Ukrainian immigrants lived and could be found in growing numbers in Winnipeg, Edmonton, and Saskatoon. In fact, probably the fullest account appeared in the Saskatoon Star Phoenix, of course, and the Vegreville Observer, which used it as its source. Now, the meeting in Saskatoon in July 1918 was held not to actually found a Ukrainian Orthodox Church, but to establish a brotherhood that would be charged with the task of doing so. That is because much work needed to be done to formally found a church that would comply with canonical requirements, be legally recognized by the Canadian government, and most important of all, have a clergy and hierarchy, if not a full hierarchy, like other Orthodox churches. That process would take almost another year and a half before the Orthodox Brotherhood was in a position to launch the Ukrainian Greek Orthodox Church of Canada, or UGOC, in Winnipeg in late November of 1918. News of its establishment was also carried in the Edmonton Journal in a short item under the heading, quote, "Ukrainians will have a new church," datelined Winnipeg. At a convention of Ukrainians here, it was decided to establish a new church upon a democratic basis, wherein all church properties will belong to the communities and not to the bishop. This was a sensitive issue that was helping to drive this whole issue of establishing the church. This is to be the Ukrainian Greek Orthodox Church and independent of the bishop. And independent of the Russian Orthodox Church, headed in Western Canada by Bishop Budka. Now, that would have been news for Bishop Budka to find out he was the head of the Russian Orthodox Church. The head of the new church will be the Syro-Arabian Metropolitan Germanos at Brooklyn, New York. Well, the story got some things right and some things wrong. It does serve as a useful illustration of how and why the Ukrainian Orthodox Church was created, at least as perceived by people outside of the Ukrainian community. But the road that led to the founding of the UJOC was long, difficult, and had many twists and turns that make it especially interesting for scholars. In my talk today, I hope to share with you that story and some of its complexities, so as to get beyond the standard narrative written up by such accounts as the histories written by Paul Yuzik, Odarka Troska, and Reverend Savchuk and Malek Lutzik. In the process, I hope you'll understand why I have titled this An Unorthodox History. Now, my paper was 97 pages long. I managed to cut it down to 67. I'm not going to read it. I'm going to flip through it and just pull things from it. So, first of all, let's establish when the first Ukrainian Orthodox came to North America. So, in 1794, a Russian mission was established on Kodiak Island off the Alaska coast. It was to serve the Russians or people from the Russian Empire who were working in the fur industry there, whaling, and that was its primary focus. But over time, more people came and more missionaries came. They moved on to the mainland, and they began also proselytizing among the Aleut people. Among the missionaries, there were people who came from the Kiev Pecharska Lavra, the Kievan Crypt Monastery in Kiev. Some of them had been educated at the Kiev Academy, and so you have a Ukrainian presence already there within the structure of the Russian Orthodox Church. In 1867, the United States purchased Alaska from Russia. 3 years later, in 1870, the Holy Synod in St. Petersburg brought into being a separate diocese of Alaska and the Aleutians, headquartered in Sitka on the Alaska Panhandle. However, in 1872, the American base of operations for the Russian Orthodox Church was transferred to the more strategically located city of San Francisco, which then became the center of Russian Orthodox missionary work in North America in the closing decades of the 19th century. More importantly, the Russian mission used its historical roots in Alaska and the fact that its center was on American soil to claim jurisdiction over all Orthodox faithful on the North American continent, a claim that was to eventually prove to be quite contentious, and not only for Ukrainians. That is because by this time, meaning the late 19th century, the number of Orthodox believers in the United States was beginning to grow with the arrival of mostly Greeks, but also immigrants from other Orthodox countries, specifically Serbs, Bulgarians, Romanians, and a few Syrians. In the meantime, an Orthodox priest, originally from Ukraine, Father Ahapius Honcharenko, who was a fugitive from Russia and defrocked in the Russian Orthodox Church, arrived on the east coast of the United States in late 1864, and shortly afterwards celebrated the first Orthodox liturgy on American soil at the Greek consulate in New York. He subsequently began holding occasional services at an Episcopal church in New York until a protest from Russian consular officials in the United States curtailed his efforts to provide pastoral services to Orthodox believers in the North New York area. Nevertheless, Honcharenko also managed to make a side trip to minister among Orthodox Greeks in the New Orleans area, and is considered responsible for helping to establish a congregation, the first Orthodox congregation in the United States, a congregation that subsequently founded Holy Trinity Greek Orthodox Cathedral in that city. So now you've got on the East Coast Father Honcharenko, and you've got on the West Coast the Russian mission, and they don't see eye to eye, of course. Basically, the Russian mission, which moved to San Francisco in 1868, they established a congregation, and their first job was to counter the influence of Honcharenko, because he had been in touch with all the Slavs and Orthodox people in the area, and they wanted to push him out of that influence. His name will come up a little bit later in the history of our church, the Ukrainian Orthodox Church of Canada, because he played a small but an interesting role in that too, decades later. Now, in the 1880s, you start getting an influx of ethnic Ukrainians coming to the United States from the western parts of Ukraine, specifically from Galicia, from Transcarpathia, the area that sort of straddles Slovakia, Hungary, and western Ukraine. You have Boykos and Lemkos, and there's a growing number of them that come in, and mostly they settled Pennsylvania, New York State, New Jersey. They work in the coal mines, they work in steel mills, factories, and this community is growing. Of course, they come in, and they're Greek Catholics primarily. There are a few Bukovynians, but mostly Greek Catholics. So the Greek Catholic Church starts sending priests. The problem immediately arises when the Irish Catholic hierarchs found out that these Greek Catholic priests are coming in, and some of them, they did not want married priests. No such thing in the Roman Catholic Church. You can't have them here. And that was the first point of friction that occurred. And a very similar thing happened in Canada, where the hierarchy was mostly French Catholics, and they were totally unfamiliar with the Eastern Church, that married priests were allowed. And so this created a tension and helped really spark the birth of orthodoxy as well in the United States, because some of these people said, well, to the Irish Catholic bishops, we're going to have our own church, and they reverted to orthodoxy. Part of what's behind all of this, you have to understand, I have to just say a few words about something called the Russophile movement. And this is going to be a very short version of it. I hope I get it right, John Paul. You can tell me if I... Basically, the Russophile movement arose in response to constant pressure by Polish Catholic authorities on the Ukrainians in Western Ukraine, and the parts of Western Ukraine that were under Polish control, in the Polish-Lithuanian Commonwealth, but then under Poland. And they wanted to make Catholics of them. Partly, I mean, this is like a big empire, and these are mixed areas, border areas. You want to secure them. You want to have people identify with the ruling power and everything like that. How can you have this Orthodox community in basically a Catholic nation? So there's a lot of pressure, and so the Russophile movement started as kind of a resistance to this, to say, no, we are an Eastern Church, we have an agreement with Rome, we're allowed to have this, and they resisted it. At the same time, you also had people in the church who said, yeah, we should do more things like the Western Church does, and they were open to reforming along Western lines. But you already have a split. The Russophile movement further split because you have people becoming radicalized over time. You have a segment of these Russophiles who then start looking at the Tsar, at Russia. The Tsar was Russian, was Orthodox. And Russian propaganda helped finance publications in Western Ukraine to spread this idea of the Tsar and that you are really Russians. You're not Ruthenians or Rusins. You are just part of the great Russian people, temporarily under the control of the evil Austro-Hungarian Empire, the rival Austro-Hungarian Empire might be a better way of putting it. And so you develop this radical element within the Russophile movement. Some of these people immigrated to the New World, primarily to the United States. And so they begin agitating on their side because they start saying, look, it was the Union of Brescia in 1596 that brought into existence. The Ukrainian Catholic Church was a mistake. We should go back to Orthodoxy. And so you have Orthodox congregations, particularly among Carpatho-Ruthenians, Carpatho-Rusins, going over to Orthodoxy. So already you have the Greek Catholic community in the States splitting. And you have this element of people who are quite radical Russophiles. And some of that influence spills over into Canada in a much more muted form, grant you. There were additional complicating factors. You also had in Ukraine a very vigorous socialist current, and mostly agrarian socialist, social democratic would be more of an accurate description, I think, of a large part of it. And they, of course, were skeptical of religion of all kinds. Many of them, actually, many of their leaders came from the priestly families. Their fathers were priests, and of course they were rebels. And they developed a very anti-clerical sort of stance, very critical of the clergy, of the church generally. So you have this element also turning things over in the community. You also have Protestantism making some inroads into Western Ukraine, where traditionally it hadn't been a factor, but it spills over from some of the German Protestant communities. It was also in the Russian Empire. You had some Protestant communities, but the Tsar's government was very careful to try to make sure that this didn't infect the Slavic population with these ideas of Protestantism. But gradually this seeped out, and so you had some people who come and they had already been exposed to Protestant ideas in the old country. Most important of all, though, I think, in terms of maintaining traditional religious loyalties, was the fact that the settlers, in leaving behind their ancestral homeland, were suddenly free to make choices that they could not make easily in the tightly knit communities they grew up in. They no longer had to worry about family members and neighbors, not to mention the village priest, carefully monitoring all of their activities and attitudes towards issues, including religion. This gave them the freedom to think outside the box and to break with the views and values that had been passed down to them for generations. And that was an important factor in the eventual establishment of the Ukrainian Orthodox churches in both the United States and Canada. Free will. They're in a new country, all kinds of opportunities, temptations, all kinds of things. You know, they could become a socialist, you could become a Protestant, you could become anything you wanted, you could reinvent yourself here. Now you have the arrival finally of Ukrainians to Canada. And of course, Pilepiu and Ilinyak are the famous founding fathers of Ukrainian settlement in Canada. They come in 1891. They never even made it to Edmonton, actually. They only got as far as Calgary. But the first Ukrainian immigrants to actually come to Edmonton and to Canada finally arrived at Strathcona Station in the second half of June 1892. They were part of a larger group of 12 families recruited by Ivan Pilepiu after his return to Austro-Hungarian Ukraine from the historic trip that he made to Canada with Ilinyak. Referred to by historians as the Nebeliev group, Pilepiu's and Ilinyak's village of origin, the entire contingent was comprised of 33 people, though the departure of some of this number was somewhat delayed because they were called as witnesses to Pilepiu's trial on charges of inciting immigration. Consequently, only six families and a single male were allowed to leave for Canada in May, 4 of the men leaving having already testified at the hearing for Pilepiu. So you have the first influx of Galicians. More come in the next year, and more and more and more of them keep coming. Bukovynian Ukrainians only started leaving for the Canadian West in 1896, 1897, so several years later. Thus, by the fall of 1898, over 100 families from 15 villages in Kitsman and Chernivtsi counties had settled roughly 90 kilometers northeast of Edmonton, along the eastern edge of what was known as the Beaver Creek, Star Wostock, or Limestone Lake Colony, founded by Ukrainians from Galicia in 1894. Meanwhile, other Bukovynian immigrants created similar settlements in parts of Manitoba and Saskatchewan. The Ukrainians from Bukovina, of course, because they were Orthodox, provided a natural constituency for the Russian mission, though even with them, problems soon arose. So now you've got this growing population of Ukrainian settlers here. They're here for several years, and they have a real problem. People are dying, children are being born, couples want to get married. You need clergy, you need a church. And so they began writing at home saying, send priests, send priests. The first Ukrainian priest to serve among the Ruthenian immigrants in Canada was a Greek Catholic cleric named Father Nestor Dimitriou. Although officially traveling on a fact-finding tour of the Ukrainian colonies of the Canadian prairies on behalf of the Department of the Interior in Ottawa, Dimitriou used the opportunities of his visits to provide for the pastoral needs of settlers, which are becoming more acute in the scattered colonies as the scattered colonies evolved and expanded with new arrivals. Everywhere he went, he blessed land for churches, for cemeteries. He heard confessions. And he did this Orthodox Catholic. Everybody came. They were so thrilled to see a priest who spoke their language. And basically the customs and the rituals were quite similar, the same. So it wasn't a big deal. He was very talented and he was very determined. And he really is the one who started religious life among the Ukrainians in Canada. So he comes in April 1897. He comes to Strathcona, or he comes to Winnipeg, he goes to northern Manitoba, he goes to southern Manitoba, he comes to Alberta, and he visits the colonies northeast of the city, and he also visited the Rabbit Hill area. Now, like I said, everybody was thrilled and people came to his services, but there were a small group of Russophile Galicians who had been influenced by this Russophile, the radical part of the Russophile movement. But even their attitudes were still very fluid, and this is one of the interesting things, that allegiances in those early years were quite loose. Many of the people, they wrote to Metropolitan Simbratovich, of the head of the Ukrainian Catholic Church in Galicia, pleading for him to send priests. And what's interesting, you see the signatories of the letters, a bunch of them ended up as founders of the Russo Orthodox Church in Star. When they didn't get the answer that they wanted from Lviv, they said, hey, there's a Russian mission in San Francisco, let's write to them. And that's what they did. You have a really interesting example of this man, Anton Savka, who wrote the letters, because he could write, and some of these, and many of these, one of the letters that went to Bishop Nicholas in San Francisco, I mean, it was all signed with, I think, 30 X's. There was only a couple of people who actually could write. And but they wrote to him asking for him to send priests. So 6 weeks after Father Demetriou visits the country, 6 weeks after he visits the country, 2 Russian missionaries come from Spokane on orders from San Francisco. Reverend Kamenev and his and deacon or precentor, I think it was Alexandrov. Now, they come and again what happens? Everybody comes to their service. And they have Father Demetriou celebrated the first service in Alberta, for instance, at Limestone Lake School, which was still under construction. It's just north of Lamont. Further north and a little bit to the east, you have the Vostok district, and that was a kind of a real stronghold of these Russophiles, radical Russophiles. And so when the Russian missionaries come, they do a service there. But in the meantime, Father Demetriou had already started the process of getting a church, a physical church, a structure, a sanctuary built in Star, Edna Star. And formed a committee, blessed the land, got the land from the government, made all the basic arrangements. Things were moving forward. And so then what happened there, like in Star, both sympathizers with the Russian mission and with the loyalists of the Greek Catholic Church together built this church. And for the next few years, they both used it. That's because for the first few years, there were just itinerant priests who come for a short while and go. They just passed through. They weren't there permanently. And so as long as there was no clash, and they came at different times, things were okay. April 15th, 1901, Easter, and at this time there's already a Ukrainian Catholic priest who's working in Alberta, and he announces he's going to celebrate service at Star Church, and the priests from the Russian mission say they're going to celebrate their Easter service at that church. Word got to the local constables. They padlocked the church. They said neither of you is going to use this until some court decides who's going to get it. So they go ahead and it goes to court. It cost hundreds of thousands of dollars. It went through the entire court system in Canada. Eventually had to be decided. It was decided in 1907 in the Privy Council in London that even though the Orthodox were in the minority, ruled in their favor, and so with the proviso that the Orthodox were now to help the Catholics build their church, which they didn't do. For some reason, the Orthodox Church at Star burned down. A Catholic church at Starpeno burned down. A second Catholic church at Starpeno burned down. Eventually it was resolved, let's put it this way. So, but you have this conflict between the two. And in the meantime, you've got the Bukovynians sitting on the sidelines of this. And for them, it's a much simpler matter. And fortunately, the Russian mission figured out that they had a toehold with the Bukovynians in Canada, and they used it in 1901. In the late summer of 1901, Bishop Tikhon, the head of the Russian mission, came all the way from San Francisco to Edmonton. He visited Rabbit Hill. He visited Vostok, where the Russian Orthodox were establishing a church, had established a congregation already. What's also interesting is the Anglican Church here helped facilitate and helped him, because the Anglicans felt this affinity with the Russian Orthodox Church. The reason being simple: they weren't Catholic. They were like high Anglicans. They had this elaborate ritual and everything. There were a lot of similarities, and there's been this long history of Anglican fascination and flirting with and whatever. Both are imperial churches in a sense. They could understand each other. So eventually, it was actually an Anglican lawyer who helped register the Russian Orthodox Church as a legal entity in Canada, and helped get the Russian Orthodox officially established, the mission here officially established. Now, so the Russian missionaries are coming, but the Orthodox Bukovynians, they're not totally happy. On the 21st of September 1898, they write a letter to Metropolitan Arkady Chuprikovich, of the Metropolitan of Kyiv. Your Grace, signed below are Greco-Orientali Orthodox Bukovynian immigrants to American Canada, comprising 115 families settled in one specific area, distinct from 30 families from Galicia who also want to convert to Orthodoxy. So these are the Russophiles. All of us graciously request that as soon as possible a priest be sent to us who knows the Little Russian, by which they mean the Ukrainian, and Bukovynian languages, meaning the Bukovynian dialect. And Bukovynian languages would also mean Romanian, because there were some Romanians who came in, intermarried with Ukrainians, some were just there, and they also were settling in the area. Because we ourselves are conducting funerals in this place, and some children are sitting here unbaptized for several months. For whenever there comes a priest who only speaks the great Russian language, our people do not understand him well, especially during Holy Confession. So here it is. This is a request motivated not by Ukrainian nationalism or anything. It's a practical one, right? They're just saying, could you please send us priests like we have at home? This turned out, the letter was written by a man named Stefan Gudzovati, but I get a kick out of the fact that the return address was given America, Canada, Alberta, Dmitro Balan, farmer. No relation, but Coincidentally, this appeal from Alberta was almost simultaneously reinforced in a letter from the Chernivtsi newspaper Bukovina by none other than Father Dmitriu. And this will tell you something about Father Dmitriu, who I have a very high regard for. He was an acquired taste, let's say, but an interesting man. And Father Dmitriu was a national populist. He was influenced by the Radical Party, Radical movement in Western Ukraine, as some clergy were. And he had a very sort of progressive outlook. In fact, you see pictures of him. It's interesting. He wore a bowler hat, and he looked totally Western. And he was an Anglophile. He really loved English culture, English people, and held them in very high regard. Anyway, Father Dmitriu wrote this long article in the newspaper Bukovina, which was read mostly by Orthodox Bukovynians. And in it, he calls out, he says, look, he appeals to the ordinariate or the administration of the Bukovynian church, please send priests. Because the Russian mission is sending priests. And if you don't send priests, they're going to get lost, right, to the Russians. This was not so there's this appeals to the Bukovynian church to help out. And this was then followed by a series of appeals from Bukovynians in Canada to the Metropolitan of Bukovina to do this. each one fell on deaf ears. 1903, 1901 a letter went from the Shandro area, another letter went 2 years later. A delegation from Mandera went in 1912 actually to Chernivtsi, comprised of Romanian and Ukrainians, pleading, please send us priests. The Goner, Manitoba wrote a letter. Lachine, Quebec wrote, that was in 1906, Lachine, Quebec. I mean, the Bukovynians tried repeatedly, and I regard this as a real missed opportunity and a real failure on the part of the Bukovynian church. That if they had intervened at that point, you would have had a canonical church presence established by, people from Bukovina, and some of them would have been Romanian, some of them would have been Ukrainian, and the history of the Ukrainian Greek Orthodox Church of Canada would have been quite different, I think, if you had that as a base. That didn't happen. Basically, the Metropolitan said, look, you people left the old country, it's your problem. There is a Russian mission there, you go to them. Priests were paid by a special fund from the government. And priests in Galicia and in Bukovina actually lived pretty good lives overall. They had a sinecure, and many of them had big land holdings, they had people working for them, they had big families, and you can understand how difficult it was to convince them to go halfway around the world and to sit in a sod hut with desperate, homesteaders struggling to get established, right? No money, it was not an attractive posting, to be honest with you. And so both the Catholic Church and the Orthodox Church had real trouble getting priests to come here. In 1905 already, there were still only 5 Catholic priests in Canada and 9 nuns, trying to serve tens and tens of thousands of Ukrainians. The Russian Orthodox Church, they also had problems getting priests to come, especially to the rural communities. But they financed them, they paid them. And so that was a better incentive, and they were able to more successfully get priests into the rural areas. Now, a big step occurred in 1900 when a priest named Jacob Korczynski, or Yakiv Korczynski, was assigned by the mission to Alberta. And Alberta was the battleground. Alberta became the real battleground between the Orthodox Catholic sort of rivalry. And Korczynski was a very interesting man. There are parts of his biography that I haven't been able to establish. He probably came from the Podlachia district or region of Ukraine, or from Bessarabia, because he spoke Romanian, and he spoke beautiful Ukrainian, and he learned English. He had served for a time in Alaska, got assigned here, and he really is the one who consolidated the Russian Orthodox Church presence in Canada, really, not just in Alberta, because he's the one who got the paperwork going and got through Parliament the act recognizing the Russian Orthodox Mission, Russian Orthodox Church as a legal entity, putting it on solid footing. And he was only here till 1902. He started St. Barbara's Congregation, which you know downtown here, still exists. He bought land. They first operated out of a house, eventually built a chapel, then they built a church, and now they've got this other church. So he, in some ways, it could be argued as the father of Orthodoxy, certainly in Alberta. And he was Ukrainian. We know this. One of the things I found interesting in the papers of Michael Golda, and I'll say a little bit about him in a bit. He wrote a letter to him, I think it was in 1908, in beautiful Ukrainian, explaining where he was. He was in the eastern seaboard of the United States. And he, don't worry, I do that all the time too. So he asking Michael Golda to help him sell some land. He had bought some lots in Edmonton. Smart move. I think he made good money on it because the city was growing. And but he said it was a beautiful letter and everything. And he ended up going back to Ukraine. He had a very tragic end, I think. The last I hear of him is in 1925. He was back in Soviet Ukraine, in Kherson Oblast. And he wrote a letter to somebody here, and it was translated and published in the Edmonton Journal, describing how the family was starving because, of course, the clergy was under intense attack by Soviet authorities. And how it all ended for him, I don't know, but it doesn't sound very promising. You have as well a company working with Father Korczynski, a precentor named Ivan Soroka. And he travels with him as he makes all of his visits around in the colony. He started out in the Vostok area, then moved into the city. But he writes in an Orthodox publication called Pravoslavnaya Bukovyna, "It is extremely difficult for one priest to manage, and no one among the Orthodox Bukovynian priests or reverend deacons wants to go and serve their people. Why, even in Bukovina, it is unknown that in Canada there are Russian Orthodox churches under the administration of the Russian bishop in the United States, residing in the city of San Francisco. And very often Bukovinian priests tell their compatriots that in Canada there will be no one to christen or marry them or give them communion. And that greatly demoralizes the Orthodox Bukovynians. Upon coming to Canada, they completely forget either who they are or that their faith is Orthodox. Frequently they take communion with Uniate, that's Ukrainian Catholic, or Polish priests. They have had their children christened and married by French-Canadian Catholic priests, and they live the lives of fornicators until they encounter an Orthodox priest. And they completely neglect to instill the Orthodox faith in their children, who often go to, horror of horrors, Latin Rite churches and take communion there. And their parents do not say anything about this to them. One Bukovinian convinced his daughter to work in a Latin Rite hospital, that would be in Mundare, and the nuns forced her to go to confession and take communion with the French-Canadian priest. And when the Orthodox believer began questioning the girl as to why she had changed her faith, the girl replied, "No one ever taught me my faith. So afterwards I changed my religion." So again, you have this situation where there's still a lot of fluidity in these early years. Now, I'm going to skip ahead. I want to just tell you a little bit about the story of one man who kind of illustrates this fluid nature of religious allegiances. Michael Goda was the first Ukrainian to take up residence in Edmonton, renting a room in the city after he had disembarked at the Strathcona railway station on 18 May 1898. So this is almost 6 years after the Nebelyevite group. Now, all those immigrants before that, they were in the city, but they were here long enough to decamp briefly at the immigration hall and to hike out into the homestead lands, choose a homestead, come in, register it, pack up their families and belongings, and go out to their homestead. They came into town on business, but there's no sort of permanent Ukrainian community here. Michael Goda was a teacher in the old country, learned a bit. He came to Canada in 1897, worked his way across from Nova Scotia at various jobs, picked up pretty good, picked up a command of English, passable command. So when he got off the train here, he was able to actually get a job as an interpreter for the Bellamy Agricultural Implement Company. Now, you all know Bellamy Hill. Well, Bellamy was a businessman. He had an agricultural implements company. He also became an alderman. But so he got the job because these farmers had come in, not just Ukrainians. He also had some Slovaks and Poles and some Germans, and of course he could speak some German too. He was very handy for helping to negotiate sales and to bring customers in. Not only that, he would go down to the train station and meet the trains as they were coming in Strathcona with the immigrants. He'd find out there's a group of 200 immigrants here. He'd go down there and direct traffic, saying, okay, the immigration hall is 2 blocks over here. The Strathcona Hotel where the men can get a beer is over here. Believe me, I'm sure it happened. And so everybody knew him. He was a very, very prominent and well-known figure. He also began writing to the newspaper Svoboda and describing what was going on the ground here. And so it's in his articles to Svoboda that we see the first rumblings of religious controversy in the community between the Catholics and the Orthodox, but also some concern about the Protestants, who were, became active just a little bit later. So he came from a devout Ukrainian Catholic family. His brother was a Ukrainian Catholic priest. There were 10 children in the family. His parents were tailors. They couldn't really afford much, to educate all the children. So the oldest son got the best education, and at the seminary in Pramish, and all Michael got was cantor school, but that was good enough. He could learn to read and write, and he was bright and gifted, so he became a teacher. But Michael was not shy, coming from a devout family. He was not shy about criticizing the Catholic hierarchs or priests, which he did in the newspaper. And that, of course, earned him a reputation as a troublemaker in Catholic circles. He criticized the Roman Catholic bishops here, and he... I'm just looking here at my time here. So he ended up being a pivotal figure, and he ended up, first of all, breaking with the Catholic Church. He married an Orthodox woman from Bukovyna in Willingdon, in the Orthodox Church. Well, that was the final thing. Not only that, in 1903, in Winnipeg, a new church was established called the Independent Greek Church. And this was started by Ukrainian Protestants. A couple of Ukrainian Protestants who had been influenced by Protestantism in Ukraine thought that it would be good to proselytize and make Ukrainians in Canada into Protestants. They went to the Presbyterian Church. The Presbyterian Church backed them financially, and they created this church. It was kind of a Trojan horse, because they knew that it was not going to be easy to wean Ukrainians off their traditional churches, the Catholic Church or the Orthodox Church. And so they kept everything pretty much the same initially. They even recruited a defrocked Orthodox monk as a bishop, the infamous Bishop Seraphim. And Seraphim, he looked like a bishop. He knew the service off by heart. He had a couple of problems. He liked women and he liked drink. So in his free time, he wasn't very bishoply, the key figures behind the church thought, this guy's a liability. They convinced him to go to the Holy Synod in St. Petersburg to get their blessing, and of course he never came back, and they overthrew him. Anyway, a couple of the proponents of this church came to Alberta. They tried to recruit BOHDAN, first of all, to be a priest in this church. He was an older man, he's a little bit smarter. He sort of, I don't think so. Didn't want to. They also tried to recruit Peter Zvarich. And the way it was interesting because he wanted to get married. There's a woman he wanted to marry, but that didn't work out either for him because she became a Catholic nun in Mundare. But I said that the church started to come in, and so now you've got this new church. Now, they kept the rituals, they wore the vestments, they did everything pretty much the same because they didn't want to rattle anybody. And so it worked for a while, and it spread like a grass fire in the community, right across the prairies. It's estimated at one point they had about 50,000 adherents. They needed priests. Well, this Seraphim, before he left, he managed to consecrate about 50 priests. Now, some of these priests were cantors, so they knew the service and things like that. Some of them were genuinely interested in becoming priests. More than a few were of what you'd call dubious character. Some of them were illiterate. Some of them, it was just a money-making thing. Hey, I'm going to be a priest. I can make money at funerals, weddings. They start figuring this out. So the church spread like this grass fire, but when people saw behind the facade of it, they began to desert in droves. And especially about 1911, I guess it was, that the Presbyterians said, look, you got to get rid of all this mumbo-jumbo that the Orthodox and the Catholics do and introduce Protestant reforms. You're going to have a superintendent, not a bishop. You're going to do group confessions. Get rid of all those pictures in your church too. So when that started to happen, people deserted in droves. But some stayed. Now, why did they stay? Well, some of them were attracted to the ideals of Protestantism. For some, it was a bit of pox on both your houses. The Catholics and the Orthodox were engaged in this huge fight, so they became Protestants. So now you've got a third church on the area. And then you've got the Presbyterian Church is doing missionary work, and the Methodist Church is doing missionary work among Ukrainians. So Ukrainians are being pulled all these different ways. And they could make lots of choices, or they could choose to be none of the above. and some chose that too. So when we're now getting up to the beginning of the Great War, and leading up to the 1918 founding of the church, the war had an interesting impact. First of all, it initially played to the advantage of the Russian Orthodox Mission, because the Russians were allies with Great Britain in the war. And so when the government imposed these restrictions on enemy aliens, Ruthenians, people from Austria, the Russophiles in the United States came up. There were Russophile leaders who came up here and stuff like that, and really pushed the line. You are not Ruthenians. You're Carpatho-Russians. You are Russian, and you are certainly not Ukrainians, right? And so it strengthened the Russophile tendency in the Russian mission here and in the United States. It also had the effect of when the let me just get to my notes here because I'm starting to drift. You have the war in Ukraine. There were atrocities committed and stuff like that. So you have this whole dynamic being unleashed by the war. The Ukrainians, then you have Ukraine, of course. The revolution starts. The Tsarist government's overthrown. There is an attempt to create a Ukrainian Orthodox Church, but it starts later, somewhat about 1918. There was no Ukrainian Orthodox Church in Ukraine at the time of the creation of the Ukrainian Orthodox Church of Canada, and that's an important factor in this. It wasn't sort of that they could turn to Ukraine because there was a war on. They couldn't get a bishop. They had to resort to this Alexandrian method that they called of consecrating a bishop, so it was very controversial. So the Ukrainian Orthodox Church was born at a time of great turmoil here. The Ukrainians who were behind the founding of the church were generally educated people, businessmen, and they were frustrated with the Catholic Church. They were frustrated with the Catholic Church going all the way back, like Michael Goda. But also, in 1912, a bishop was assigned to Canada from Ukraine, Bishop Nikita Budka, and he became a very polarizing figure. First of all, when the war broke out, he made the mistake of issuing a pastoral letter reminding everybody that where their loyalties lay. And when the loyalties were Austro-Hungary and Canada's at war with it, that was not a good move. He backtracked on it really quickly, but it did him a lot of damage. It's unfortunate because I have a lot of sympathy for Budka, who came in at a difficult time, wasn't really experienced, and had a lot of problems that he had to, issues that he had to deal with, and this was thrown on him. So that was the first thing that happened. And then, of course, you have happening again the accusation of sedition in 1918. But meanwhile, the intelligentsia, this group behind the push for a national church, they felt that the Catholic Church was not patriotic enough. It wasn't concerned enough about preserving Ukrainian language and culture in Canada. There were suspicions of the church because in the old country, they felt that the church was selling out to the Poles. Here they were selling out to the French. So you have all of these issues sort of floating around and driving the creation of the Ukrainian Orthodox Church. Just to finish, the church, I said, the brotherhood that was created in July of 1918, set about the task of finding priests, a hierarch. They needed a bishop. They thought they had one They thought they had one a few months later because they entered into negotiations with the Russian Mission of all people. The head of the church at that time was Metropolitan Platon, and he was assisted by Bishop Alexander Nemilovsky. Nemilovsky is a very interesting character because he was a Volynyak. He was from Volyn. He was Ukrainian. He spoke Ukrainian, and he had sympathy for Ukrainian aspirations. And then, of course, in Ukraine, you have this huge upsurge of patriotism as the creation of an independent Ukrainian state. And that sweeps up a good part of the community here too. And so this is also driving this, saying we need a church that's Ukrainian, we need a church that's Ukrainian, and not under the French, not under our own church. Platon was an intelligent man and experienced, and he saw that he figured he could make an accommodation with the Ukrainians. He said, okay, him and Nemilovsky. Nemilovsky was at that time the head of the Russian Orthodox Mission in Canada. So they had assigned a separate bishop for Canada already, so that's a big step. They were adapting to the changing circumstances, and they, Nemilovsky and Bishop Platon Metropolitan Platon were prepared to enter into an agreement that they would allow a Ukrainian Orthodox Church to exist under the umbrella of the Russian Orthodox Mission with autonomy and their own bishop. Well, that worked for the founders of the Ukrainian Orthodox Church of Canada. The two bishops are supposed to come to a sabor in Winnipeg in the fall. The sabor was put off until after the harvest. They had chose one date and they said that was a mistake. And in the meantime, they publicized the fact that the Russian Orthodox bishops were coming and they were going to help establish this church. Well, when the Russian Orthodox, the Russophiles in the United States, and the Russian chauvinists in the Russian Church in the United States heard that they were supporting these Mazapists, they went berserk. And so that all fell through. All of that fell through, and they ended up having to go. They found out that this metropolitan from the Syrian Orthodox Church was in the United States, Szegedi, Metropolitan Germanos Szegedi, I think it is. And so they turned to him, and he had already had his conflicts with the Russian Orthodox Mission, because the Romanians, the Russians, they also didn't really. They said, "What do you mean you have jurisdiction here alone? We want to establish our own churches here." And Szegedi took them under their protection, and for 3 years he served as the head of the church until a Ukrainian bishop was found. Final thing I'll say is that again, to give you an idea, the Orthodox Church, Ukrainian Orthodox Church, has a reputation for being insular as well as nationalistic and all kinds of other things. They, the man who trained the first priests was a Romanian theologian, a Romanian priest, Father Lazar German, not to be confused with Germanus. And he was from Bukovina, and he was sympathetic to Ukrainians. He himself was Romanian, but he knew Ukrainian. And his goal was to establish a Romanian Orthodox Church separate in North America, but the Romanian parishes were few and far between. They were scattered all over. There was a lot fewer of them. He ended up connecting with the Ukrainians. He hit it off, and they said, look, we need somebody to establish a college to train our priests, because we have no priests. The church was not created from top down. It came from bottom up. And it wasn't like a group of priests all broke off. Some priests came over from the Russian mission. Some priests came over from the Ukrainian Catholic Church. Some priests came over from the something called the Polish National Church. And some people had been priests in the independent Greek Church and ended up as priests in the Orthodox Church, got taken in. So the Orthodox Church was cobbled together with all of these different entities and individuals. And I think that gave it a certain feel. I mean, for one, it made it a little bit shaky, because the Catholics, of course, lashed out at this sort of, what kind of a church is this? It's not a serious church. And the struggle went on for decades between the Catholics and the Orthodox. The Protestants kind of fell more by the wayside. They were active into the 1930s, were still active in the Ukrainian community, but eventually kind of assimilated into mainstream Protestant institutions. And the enmity between the Ukrainian Catholics and the Orthodox gradually faded with time. There still is a little friendly pot shots that go back and forth, I think. Fair to say, you hear it occasionally.
Catholics pray for you every Sunday.
That's true. And I don't really mean it when I take shots at my Catholic friends. But no, I think that what you can see, though, you had a whole series of things that happened. And to simplify it, as often is the case, that, this was a church created by Saskatoon and a handful of intellectuals who were ticked off with the Catholic bishop. Yeah, that was part of this. That's only a small part of the story. This is a church that was created because the people who built these churches didn't want them to register them under the eparchy, because they were afraid that, then the French Catholics own the land, and so we built this and they could take it from us. We don't want that. They didn't trust them. That's part of it too. There were Catholic churches that remained, congregations remained Catholic and had their little disagreements with the eparchy over church, who was the owner of the church. But so that was only part of it. But you've got this, Russophilism, the independent Greek church, the Protestant influence, the war, the revolution in Ukraine. All of this went into the mix, and all of it resulted in the creation of the Ukrainian Greek Orthodox Church of Canada. They dropped the Greek about 20 years ago. It was just to underscore that it was Eastern Church, and people are still confused. There's still people who don't understand the difference between Ukrainian Orthodoxy, Russian Orthodoxy, but maybe in about another 50 years that'll change too. Thank you very much.
I assume that you'll take some questions, Yaros?
I don't have any answers, but go ahead.
So we'll invite questions.
Look at that. Come on, Father, come now. You've got your hands on
It's not compulsory. Oh, yes.
I'm interested to know the history a little bit of the Ukrainian Orthodox Church in Ukraine prior to the Bolshevik Revolution, because I think you said coming into just after that period, the Ukrainian Orthodox Church did not exist in Ukraine. But to not misunderstand this in any way, but there was one prior.
Well, there was an Orthodox Church in Ukraine with Ukrainian bishops who had parts, different eparchies, also Ukrainian faithful. But it was part of like a province, it was part of the Russian Orthodox Church, the larger Russian Orthodox Church. And when the movement from below rose to say, look, we should have Ukraine is an independent country, this is all spurred by the fact that Ukraine declared independence. We are entitled to an independent church. And they met, but they couldn't convince any of the bishops who were Ukrainian to come over to lead this church. And so there was a problem. And then the Civil War broke out. It was impossible to even bring, somebody, like to bring a bishop from Georgia or from another Orthodox church in to consecrate a hierarchy. And they were stuck without a hierarchy. And so they did some research. They found a precedent that they believe was set in Alexandria, where the hierarchy was created first of all by the laying of hands by the priests themselves. Normally you need two hierarchs to make a third hierarch, to do the laying on of hands. They didn't have one hierarchy, so what they did was they created one hierarch by the laying on of hands of the clergy, and there were clergy, and then they made a second one, and then the third bishop was made the traditional way. They reverted to the traditional way with the two bishops creating the third bishop. This had consequences for the church in Canada afterwards, not good consequences, I should say, subsequently, but basically that's what it is. And now, in Ukraine now you've got this situation where you have a Ukrainian Orthodox Church that calls itself the Ukrainian Orthodox Church, not in the Kiev Patriarchate, but under the Moscow Patriarchy. Autonomous. No. You just have.
There's three.
Yeah,
There's also not a separate. That's not a big one, so I just ignore that for now. I know. There's Orthodox-like churches, especially to have about 5 or 6 different ones. That way you can be sure that one of them's got to have it right, I think. So, but no, that's why there was no Ukrainian Orthodox Church. So it isn't like they could turn to that. We broke ground here. We made history here in a whole variety of ways. It was a church created from the bottom up. It wasn't clergy and bishops that broke away from a church. It was ordinary people. And then when they said, we need priests, some of these people who were behind the church said, okay, I'll become a priest. And they studied to become a priest, and they learned and they served. Father Samats, Father Strachchuk, and Father Savchuk were the first 3 priests. And they were all school teachers initially, and very committed to the community, and they felt that, look, it's important that we have our own church. and they dedicated their lives to the priesthood.
Well, just a short supplemental. Was there an Orthodox church by some other prefix, such as Russo, Rus being an old word for Ukraine way back when?
Well, the Russian Orthodox Mission, for the longest time, called itself the Russo. You look in these churches here; they were Russo Orthodox.
And it still exists near Lamont, for instance.
Well, what's happened in the last 6 or 7 years? They're all using Russian Orthodox now.
No, they're using Russian Orthodox priests.
No, but they're also even the signage and the leaflets that they produce. More and more, it's all Russian Orthodox Church. And what's really ironic is there are no Russians out there.
No, they're all Ukrainians.
They're all Ukrainians, and they know that. And some of them aren't happy. They still go to that church. Now, one of the questions that I find interesting is that once the Ukrainian Greek Orthodox Church of Canada was created, okay, so then you have all these Bukovynian Orthodox parishes. Some come over right away. So the church in BOCIURKIW, just outside of Willingdon, in 1920 already goes over to the Orthodox Church. Shandro Church, which was founded also by villagers from BOCIURKIW, same villages in Bukovina. They stayed with the Russian Orthodox Mission, and still are with the Russian what they call the Patriarchal Church, the Moscow Patriarchal Church. Other parishes came on a little bit later, 5, 10, 20 years later. Father Hrustovka, so some of you here, the older Orthodox members will remember, he was a priest in the Russian Orthodox Mission, as was his father. But he came over in 1941 or something, brought 13 parishes with him. And then he became a priest in the Ukrainian Orthodox Church. Now, I should also say that it all didn't go just into the Orthodox Church. You had an interesting story of Father Panteleimon Boziuk, who was from my father's village in Bukovina, Unut, born and raised, came to Canada with his father. He ends up going into the priesthood in the Russian Orthodox Mission. In 1918, when they were forming the Ukrainian Orthodox, 1990, he was at the Sobor, and the leaders of this church were lobbying like crazy with him, come over and be a priest in our church, come over and be a priest in our church. He said no. 3 years later, what did he do? He joins the Ukrainian Catholic Church. And it's interesting, he wrote a little booklet about it, why I went to the Catholic Church. And what's interesting is he has this wonderful little vignette. He describes the influence, the impact that Bishop Budka had on him. Bishop Budka has sort of gone down in history as kind of this aloof, cold, autocratic, stiff sort of guy. And yet, in Father Panteleimon Boziuk's account, they were both in hospital at the same time in Toronto. And he describes him as this warm, welcoming, just a totally different image of him. So here's a priest that went the other way. And I said, you have historically, even after the Second World War, you have some of the immigrants who come here, who come from the Ukrainian Catholic Church, and they end up in the Orthodox Church. And you have intermarriages and complicating things. I just wanted to say for Mykola Vorotelenko, you heard about the deal that the Ukrainian Orthodox Church here was willing to make with the Russian Orthodox Mission in 1918, and that it fell through. Even the relationship between the two. I mean, in our church now, in the Ukrainian Orthodox Church of Canada, there are many people who come from rural areas. They're members of a Russo Orthodox, or now Russian Orthodox Church in the rural areas. When they die, they get buried there because that's where their Baba and Dido and aunts and uncles, the whole family is buried. And we do a service here at the cathedral, and then they go out to their parish church, and it's a Russo Orthodox service. And so there's a lot of, again, blurring of things that go on. Nothing is black and white in any of this stuff. Father Cornell.
You mentioned Father Jakub Kaczynski's end in Kherson. That actually wasn't his end.
No.
No, he ended up coming back. He ended up missionizing in the Philippines.
Oh, okay, yeah.
And Hawaii. And then I think the first time he goes back to Ukraine is because his wife is ill, and they decided they need to go back, closer to the Black Sea, where the weather is better for her to heal. He does missionizing in Hawaii and the Philippines, and then he goes back and he settles in Odessa. There he's arrested just before the Second World War, and he was shot and killed in 1941, I think. And he is actually, I looked this up, he's actually been listed in the list of what's now known
Thank you. I'll get the details from you so I can think. I was just going to say I saw Vadim Kukushkin's a friend of mine here who was kind enough to do research in the Russian Orthodox Church archives, which are very interesting, the letters and stuff like that. So I said when you're looking at the roots of the Ukrainian Orthodox Church of Canada, you got to look in a lot of different places. So, Igor?
At the end of your talk, you mentioned the name Saskatoon.
You notice I didn't talk a lot about him, and yet the church became sown with this label that it was a Svistoonite church.
For decades after, Catholics called it Svistoonska Tsarkva and called Orthodox Svistoone. That continued until the post-World War II immigration, when you had a new immigration who knew nothing about Svistoon and Svistoone, but that whole generation that grew up, that went through that whole creation of the Orthodox Church, etc., to them, for decades, they called them Svistoone.
Well, that was a disparaging term, obviously. Sort of, Svistoon was a political operator, a community activist, a little bit of a loose cannon, and so it was a way of...
But you didn't mention what role he played in the creation of the...
Well, he's part of it. See, now you'll notice in that first thing where they mentioned these 1918, the people who came to the secret conference, he's not listed there. He was there. And he played a key role. He was going back and forth to the United States and talking, and he challenged Bishop Budka directly. And I mean, his own trajectory is also very interesting because he's Greek Catholic by background. He becomes the rector of the Mohela Institute. This is at a time when it was non-denominational, and so they accepted you could be a Protestant. It was established, 1916? You could be a Protestant, you could be Catholic, you could be Orthodox, Russo, or whatever. And the bishop and the Catholic the church leaders did not like this. They said, no, we don't want, it should be a Catholic institution. And so already there was a conflict with them there, and it started with that and just continued on. But again, the Svistoonitis was a label that was sewn onto the church. It's much bigger than the story of, this is not just the Svistoonite church. There are all these other things that went into it. Svistoon played a big role, but Bill? Oh, sorry.
Yeah, and then, just a small detail on the exhortation by Bishop Budka at the start of the First World War. He did that, I believe, before Canada entered the war.
Right. But tensions were high, and then anti-immigrant sentiment. I mean, just everything, and you could see from the press that they just got a lot of things. They just didn't understand a lot of nuances or anything like that. So, no, Bill.
A general question, a specific one. I understand that when Athenagoras met Pope Paul VI, that they mutually canceled the anathemas between the two churches. So does that in effect mean that the schism no longer exists? My second question is specific to the Russian Orthodox Church in Highway 19, when you go west of Leduc. My grandfather helped to build that church there, which was Catholic in 1900. Now, I've heard stories that later on there was actually a physical altercation between the Orthodox and the Catholics, and the Orthodox won. Is that true?
I don't know the specifics of it, but it sounds like it's certainly within the realm of possibility. Eugene Topolnitsky is here. Yeah, Eugene. Okay. So Bukovyna Church. Your roots are in Bukovyna Church, right?
That's right.
And
St. Nicholas Church at Plostok.
Okay, so this is a Bukovynian church. Bukovenci formed it. They did not. It came to a vote in 1921 or something like that, as to whether they should join the Ukrainian Orthodox Church or stay with the Russian Orthodox Mission. One vote decided it, that it stayed, right? That was the civilized way of doing it. In other places, it was done a little bit differently.
John Paul?
Yeah, my impression is that the movers and shakers in the founding of the Ukrainian Greek Orthodox Church in Canada, were primarily or about to be Greek Catholics who were radicalized. When were the Bukovynians right there at the beginning of the ball game, or did they?
That's a really good question. This is why I find very interesting looking just at parishes. So The first Ukrainian Orthodox service in Alberta was celebrated at Suceava, just south of Andrew. In 1916, they lost their priest because there was no money, right? And the priest wasn't going to sit out there in the boonies from the Russian Mission at St. Michael's Church, I believe it is. And so, but there's a church there and there's a manse that's empty. The first priest of the Ukrainian Greek Orthodox Church